Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm summer's sort of evening here in the Eastern Cape province. So I'm at Kuzuka Lodge Game Reserve, which is just bordering Addo, and this is the heart of the subtropical thicket biome. And in front of us here we see a nice example of a fence line contrast. So fence line contrasts occur in all biomes, but it seems to be quite stark in the thicket biome, where two properties have had historically different levels of land utilization. So in front of us here, the area to the left, which you can see is a little bit more luxuriant, is a little bit more intact, there's more greenery, has had lower domesticated stock on it than the area on the right, which is a little bit more open. So this is not the starkest fence line contrast I could find. This one just one of the more accessible ones. And yeah, fence line contrasts are pretty ecologically useful. So for one thing, they show us how degradation affects things like vegetation community, biomass, soil, and also for thicket restoration specifically, they are very useful as site selection tools. So these are pretty solid, robust evidences of where degradation has occurred, and therefore we can reliably use the site on the right here, the degraded site, as a reference site for what degraded thicket looks like. So I'm going to go in here and just go through a few common sort of aspects of thicket degradation, specifically succulent thicket degradation. Firstly going into the intact side on the left, and then just a mosey on the degraded side. Alright, so we are in the intact side. You can see quite a big dominance of Portulacaria afra spectrum over here. This is pretty characteristic of arid thicket. So this is specifically Sunday's arid thicket we are in. Although I think this is mapped as Albany Valley thicket actually, but sometimes between these specific vegetation types is very strong overlap. So this is strongly suggestive of Sunday's arid thicket as well. So the luxuriantness and the intactness of this area is partly due to this having a drainage line straight through it. You can see the size of some of the thicket trees here. There's quite a large Papia capensis over there, another one over there, and there's a sprawling scotia just in the foreground as well. So we can see there's quite a lot of cover, quite a lot of shade. The conditions here in summer can be quite hot, temperatures exceeding of 40 degrees Celsius, and the cover given by Portulacaria afra over here does a lot to ameliorating the harsh conditions. And of course in these open areas these thicket tree species cannot really recruit, and so the spectrum does play a role in facilitating the recruitment of other species. I think we can have a look at some of the litter layer underneath spectrum. So we can see a lot of organic matter, no soil compaction really, retaining the decent amount of moisture, and an ideal location for seedling recruitment from some of these thicket species like Papia, like Eucalyptus, and like Scotia afra. The increased canopy cover as well gives opportunity for some herbaceous species and some shade tolerant grasses. We have some Erharta here, and we have the Abdul-lateef sonoratianum here, one of the herbaceous species liking the shade. The increased sort of architecture of all these trees and shrubs and spectrum also gives habitat for the vines and climbers, which are numerous in thicket. So we have an asparagus over here, and also Roycissus here, Roycissus stridentata. You can just see how exceptionally dense intact thicket can be. Very often spectrum being extremely dominant, up to 9% cover in some areas, but a lot of these spinacean shrubs as well, these sprawling shrubs like the Spatalicia pyracantha, and we have Circia as well over here. I think this is a Circia terota. Two really common families in terms of the thicket shrubs, the Anacardiaceae, mostly represented by the genus Cercia, and then the Silistraceae represented by a number of species. Patalicia, Gymnosporia, Matinus, for example. I'm just looking at the Hopewell Pass here with the skeleton of a cabbage tree, Gusonia spicata, as I'm making my way outside of the intact thicket and to have a look at the degraded side. And here we are on the degraded side. It's not the greatest example of degraded thicket because there still are a few remnant bush clumps, some large remnant speckworms, but just concentrate on the open areas. So we do find a lot of better examples of offense on contrast where the degraded section is completely open. And yeah, so on the fence line contrast is, just if I can get a view of the intact side from here, you'll see there's no change. There's no change in geology, both of it is on dwicatellite. There's no change in aspect, both are sort of slightly north facing. You can see it over there. Very comparable, and the only variable being that the side has presumably had more land utilization. So I'll be looking at a few indicators of degradation. For one is the influx of weedy annual charoid species, hardy species, most commonly Pensancana. So Pensancana is a little dwarf shrub, very common in the Namakaru biomes. A member of the Asteraceae, frost tolerant, known as Ankurkaru commonly, and they do tend to proliferate in degraded thicket, taking advantage of the thicket being opened up and using that as a niche. Another common indicator of degraded thicket is the prostrate succulent annual plants. This is most commonly represented by Mesembryanthemum atonus, or Mesembryanthemum species in general, like Crystallinum and Guericianum. Also by another species of the same family. This seems to be an Azun glenoides. We have another Azun over here, which is a bit of hairier Azun. So we have the suite of species that all share the characteristics of being succulent, normally members of the Azoaceae, sprawling habit, prostrate habit, annual, and like areas of disturbance. So we have a Chasmatophyllum over here, which sort of fills that characteristics. And then we have quite a few annual grasses as well, like Aristida, and some grasses indigenous to the open areas here, also taking advantage of the habitat sort of changing and the canopy disappearing. Things like Digitaria and Panicum at times as well. Apologies, not Panicum, it's Erogrostis I was thinking of. Another good indicator is the presence of these remnant, isolated, sort of umbrella-shaped thicket trees, like this Papia over here. In some areas we see thickets turning into what they call a pseudo-savanna. So it's an open matrix with the scattered remnant trees. And the recruitment of these species, especially from seeds, requires a closed micro habitat, one created by speckworm. So the trees reaching this stature in an area that's open as this, one would assume that it recruited in a time where there was a closed canopy. And this assumption is definitely strengthened in areas with a high incidence of these isolated trees like we have here. Looking under the bush clumps or underneath the canopy of these trees, we tend to find like a little microhabitat as well. Like we have a Lycium here taking advantage, we have a Patalicia growing, but very often weedy or non-native species do come in here. There's a native weedy Chenopodium I know that often comes in here, but things like Limium, Ethiopicum, and like this Opuntia, which is not native South Africa. And another weedy native species here, this is Solanum tomentosum. So yeah, that's the three characteristics of, I guess, degraded thicket. Structural characteristics, the proliferation of charoid shrubs, mostly Pensancana, the proliferation of prostrate succulent annual plants like azune and mesembryanthemum, and the presence of these remnant isolated umbrella-shaped trees. And I think I'll end off that video here as we look at the sunset over the Sierberg Mountains.